Greetings, folks. Dan Mack here from the Shred Check, here with Evgeniy from Red Cain. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to
Yeah,
the conversation.
yeah, excellent, excellent. So I have a handful of questions. Going to dive into a little bit of everything with you, but first I want to know a little bit about a little bit of past stuff. So tell me about the formation of Red Cain.
Yeah, it was a long story. I'll start as far back as I can.
Mm-hmm.
I come from a fairly musical family. On my mother's side, her dad, my grandpa, is an immense musical talent. So when I grew up, I was constantly surrounded by all kinds of music. He's a multi-instrumentalist, so he played guitar, accordion, everything, and then listened to music from a super early age. Um, and so the musical background was already there. I didn't get a chance to really practice much of it back home before I moved to Canada, but when I did move to Canada and I saw the metal scene here, after the first few shows, I was like, I got to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And it was funny too because I wasn't really into rock or metal much until I came here. I was mostly doing things like pop, classical. I even had a bit of a trance kind of Euro trance phase. But of course, when I first went to a metal show, I was like, holy shit, this is it. So the idea to get a band going was born around that time, probably when I was about 15, 16. I went through the conservatory back in Russia, Ukraine. So I had already some musical background. And from that point on, it was just kind of coming up with a vision and the idea behind it. And so the idea always was to use the same influences that I grew up with, which was like, Eastern European folklore, Eastern European musical tradition, and marry it to the heavy metal sound, just like the awesome, heavy, kind of Western, super popular, like new wave of British heavy metal to prog metal to black metal to death metal, all those things, and see what I can come up with.
Mm-hmm.
So I was in a few other bands before Red Cain. It was an interesting experience to understand where I wanted to go with the band, and so that helped shape the sound that we eventually did. We formed in 2016. It was myself and a couple of my close friends, also musicians, and then we grabbed a couple of others. And then the idea initially was to release an EP without even worrying about shows. We wanted to firmly lock down that sound that we wanted to have. And so our first EP, the self-titled one, made a fair bit of waves because we just kind of had all of these years and years of ideas slowly coalescing into what the EP became, and it had a ton of eclectic influences, and it was fairly raw that I look back upon it, but it was definitely different from a lot of Canadian stuff for sure, and even larger in the North American scene. It was fairly unique, so I think we were able to lay claim to a sliver of the sound that was by its nature something different than bands were offering at the time. And then for us, it was an interesting journey as well to understand: can we do this? Can we realize this particular vision? What does it even look like? What does it sound like? And then can we do it live? And that part I think was immensely successful because as soon as we stepped on stage locally, everybody was like, "These guys are interesting." And to me, like when people think you're interesting, it's not even a good or bad. It's basically you have to capture their attention first. And we did manage to do that. That first year, we ended up winning the YYC Music Awards with one of our singles, which was a fairly high-profile Calgary music kind of red carpet ceremony, which was super interesting. It was an exposure to us to like the official side of the business. And then we ended up playing Loud as Hell Metal Festival as a result of that, which was also super cool. So by the end of the year, we were fairly firm in our convictions as a band. And we had taken the first steps to realize this vision. And it was a little bit all over the place, but the main elements were there. It was proggy, it was heavy. There was a power metal element with vocals. It had very strong Eastern European overtones in terms of the melodic content and the concepts. And then we had visuals. We actually managed to land Peter Moorbacher, who illustrates for Magic the Gathering and a couple of other fairly high-profile like trading card games, we got him to feature on the album cover, and it was a super cool album cover, and that got us a bunch of attention as well. So from that point on, visuals actually came in fairly strongly into our band image. And so I think that was basically in a nutshell, the formation of the first era of the band.
Okay.
Yeah.
In going with that, I know that you had mentioned the original Red Cain EP, which is available for listening on Bandcamp still, and I know that some of those songs ended up finding their way onto your first album, Kindred Act One. As far as the general core of what you create, what your music is, actually, what would you kind of give yourself, what would you title yourself as a subgenre, like if you had to name it in some capacity? Because like you said, there are many influences to it, and you know, I've seen a lot of words thrown at me like in the last few days of doing research, and I'm like, okay, but like it is that varied, but how would you describe it?
It's always a question that I really don't want to answer in one particular way, because then I like to bounce the question onto people who describe us as opposed to ourselves. But we've toyed with the idea of coining some kind of genre for us. You know, there are certain bands, like a band called Cybreed that coined deathwave. There was, you know, bands like Him from way back that coined love metal and various other things. We considered something like that. I'm not sure if we want to go that direction. It seems a little bit pompous, and creating an entire genre for yourself is a little bit, yeah, maybe not yet, maybe at some point down the road. But generally, the funny thing is, after trying all of these different terms, I usually just tell people it's heavy metal at this point.
Okay.
And I know this is not like a sexy answer, but at the same time, we do place a large emphasis on including all the different subgenres, or most of the different subgenres. In our last album, we had Black Death, even some metalcore elements. We had obviously power prog, you know, goth kind of elements, or orchestration are always present in our tracks. Like the modern metal elements of the electronic layers and effects and everything are there. So it's difficult to say. Some words that do come to mind is obviously groove. We do focus heavily on groove. I don't think we're masters of groove, but I think it's something that we do tend to focus quite heavily in our music. And of course, the cornerstones are power and prog. So those, if I had to combine a bunch of terms and throw them in the pot, so to speak, those would be the main ones. But yeah, really the conversation goes around like, what service does that do to us? And I find it personally more interesting when people describe us in all kinds of different terms every time, rather than having like a lockdown narrative.
So basically, we'll just throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. So
yeah, I mean, yeah, if you want to put it that way, it's the thing that I like about metal in general, and also the ability to work with all the different cross genres, is not having to follow the various cliches. And that's actually something that I like about not being a huge band. There's no judgment, you know, there's no Metallica level shit storms when you do something a little bit different. So while we have that option, I intend to take it. And I think to some extent, even after 3 albums, we're still finding our sound. So it's also avoiding a label internally for us, to avoid us trying to shoehorn our work into that label.
Understood. Okay. Now you, as far as being vocalist, who influences you the most as far as your style?
Well, I'll give you the main ones. I think my influences are fairly varied, especially now that I'm working on perfecting my craft, which is this super long journey, and I consider myself fairly early along it. But The first one that really influenced the way I did my vocals was Billy Valo from him.
Mm.
So my exposure to metal when I came to Canada and kind of got into the scene outside of the local bands was him with, at that time, who were in their peak with their Greatest Love Songs, Volume 666, and Love Metal, etc. And then Nightwish was the second band, obviously with a female-fronted singer. That wasn't a huge influence. And then a little later it was Camelot. So Roy Khan was, I would say, dramatically influential on me becoming a metal singer as opposed to just a good singer. So if I had to name three, I would go Willy Valo, Roy Khan, and then the third one's a difficult one, but I like to mention Jorn Lande.
Oh yes.
The one element that I've always wanted to include in my vocals was the ability to sing raspy. And it took me a long time to get to that point, and Jorn Lande was obviously a master and still is. So he was fairly influential in that sense. Yeah. So those are the main three, I would say. There are many others, but yeah.
Understood. Okay, cool. Now, you had mentioned that being a smaller band, you have that opportunity to not have to have any fear of change and whatnot. And like I was saying earlier about walking from the EP into Kindred Act 1, I feel like that established a core sound for you guys, and then you took it up a notch in Act 2 by basically just taking the same thing and then just throwing more on top of it, like just more elements on top of it. How, as far as a writing process, how does that work out for you guys? Because there's so many different things to these songs that, I mean, does it start off as just the basic instruments and then you add all the rest of the stuff on top, or does it come from various ideas of individual parts that you just throw together?
Yeah, those are interesting questions. So when we went from Kindred Act 1 to Kindred Act 2, it was a very strategic process to add things. We had looked at Kindred Act 1 and found gaps where we could improve, and those were the additions. So from a vision perspective and what the sound had to be like at a high level, that drove the songwriting process. From a practical perspective, there's a fairly ironed out way that we do this now. There's usually a few core songwriters within the band, just by the nature of how the instruments fall together. They tend to be myself as the vocalist and the guitarist, one or both. It usually begins with a particular vision for the song. For me, it's either a concept that I want to convey, and then with the concept comes the different kind of atmosphere, emotion, the level of heaviness, tempo. From that, we can usually extrapolate, like, what are some similar pieces of songs that have the same feel that we want to carry across. So what we usually do is we have a couple of listening sessions, and we were like, okay, like here's a fantastic band, and here's something they do quite well. Is there anything that we could potentially bring from this into our music? And so we usually take like little crumbs of things. Like I remember in a couple of songs, it was like the way that the bass rolled off right before a chorus kicked in. We were like, oh, that's super cool. That can give us the needed emphasis. So those little pieces start kind of shaping the portions of the track. And then what usually happens is I come up with hooks. It could be vocal hooks. It could be a particular riff that I think works super well for that element. And so what I usually do is I grab that, and we all have home studios, so it's really easy to just sit down and grab a guitar, grab a microphone, track a rough demo, and then we've got a piece of the song. Then it basically gets thrown around to the different band members, they contribute to it. We have a discussion, and then when more pieces get generated based on the initial demo, I usually grab them all. I write an arrangement. I usually have lyrics in mind by this point. So at that stage in the game, it's just a matter of making sure the Red Cain sound comes through, that there's enough layering, that everything is quality. We work, or I specifically work extremely diligently on vocal lines. So I think I usually have probably 7 or 8 revisions of the vocal lines before they make it into the album, to make sure that the nuance is there in the vocal delivery, because to me that's huge. You're doing a disservice to your fans if you're not perfect in your vocal delivery in terms of what you want to achieve with the track. So I think that takes quite a bit of time to do. But once the vocals are set in stone, we usually sit down and have a listening kind of period with the rest of the band, and then if anything needs to be added, changed to the instrumentals, that takes shape around the vocal line. And we've gotten pretty good with that process these days. All of us have like extra stuff lying around from before as well, so we tend to be able to make use of it quite well in new tracks. The interesting part around that, though, is that in this newest album that we are approaching, we stripped things down quite a bit. So we took a step back and we did a much more organic collaborative process. So it'll be really interesting to see what the reception is for that, because it was kind of like there's not as much layering, but there's a lot more grit. It's more raw, and the writing process was faster than we usually had. Sorry, it's kind of a long-winded answer. It's difficult to formulate some of these things, actually.
No, it's perfectly fine. From what I understand, Kindred Act 1 and 2 are conceptual, correct?
That's right.
So who? Well, first off, like who writes it lyrically? Is it you?
Yeah.
Okay. So where do you get your influence as far as the lyrical? Their lyrical content?
Everywhere. I read a ton. I've got a fairly eclectic set of interests. We basically, when we started thinking about the concept behind Red Cain and how we'd formulate the Kindred albums specifically, it was always meant to be a clash between ancient and modern in some way. And I'm heavily interested in both, future elements such as, the race into space and transhumanism, and where does the human race and humans as a species, where do they lead? Sci-fi. I'm a huge reader of sci-fi. Stanislav Lem, Alistair Reynolds, Adrian Tchaikovsky, you name it. Like I read this all the time. From an educational perspective, but also because it's really fun to see what kind of speculation comes out of some brilliant minds. So that combined with my interest in mythology, and obviously like a heavy dose of mythology that I received as a child, because we had a strong oral tradition back home. Obviously, a lot of tales. Eastern European myth is it's pretty twisted, but it's pretty interesting. I mean, people have gotten a glimpse of it through The Witcher now, so that's cool. But I was growing up with that, and I always found it fascinating. So marrying those two things was always the target with Red Cain. And so Kindred, those 2 albums were meant to be our attempt to do that in a story. The concept was essentially dealing with that. There were central characters that featured in all the tracks. But if I had to put a theme to it, that was that.
Okay. Now you mentioned a 3rd album that's going to be forthcoming. I believe the Fisher King single came out in November of last year.
Correct.
Okay, so that has been available for streaming and whatnot, and again, it fits the band perfect. It is kind of, it feels like a continuation of where you're going, where you went with Kindred Act 2. From what I understand, from what I've read, that was actually a track that had its inception years earlier. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I don't actually know what it says about us as a band. Have we evolved, or are we?
I'm
Are we
saying
going?
you. I'm saying you evolved. So
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think. Well, I do think we've evolved. Yeah, that's it is a track that was one of the first that I had written with a view of eventually making it to a Red Cain album. I think it's at that time it was a different feel than what we were going for. But we managed to modernize it here. It's very close to what it was before, but I think now that we understand what the Red Cain sound is like, it was really easy to take a track like that and put it back into the rotation. It's fitting because in many ways, this album is us going back to a sort of basics level of where we originate in terms of our musical sound. And in my opinion, every band has to do that at some point. It doesn't have to be 30 years down the road, but you always have to remind yourself what is it that inspired you to write music. And so with this new album, it was both on a musical sense, where did we come from as a band, and then also in a conceptual sense, what influenced us as storytellers, which of course is relevant to the concept behind the album. That is likely part of the reason why it was easier to integrate Fisher King, even in its previous version, to this album. But I think it's also a testament to the fact that we're able to develop and continue to push a consistent sound, that little like internal central element of our sound that still persists, even though we do tend to experiment a ton in a lot of our tracks. So if you're saying that it is a progress and it definitely sounds like a Red Cain track, to me that's a huge win and a big compliment, because it hits both of those points. It's new, but it's also old. And of course it ties into the whole concept that I just talked about of the ancient and the modern, and how they combine together. So it's an interesting microcosm.
Is there a specific point in time we can expect the third album?
Tentatively, we're looking at an April release.
April release, okay. Now, I speak this question from being a collector of physical medium, CDs, vinyl, cassette, and everything. I know that Kindred Act 1 is available on CD on your Bandcamp. You re-released it at some point. Has there been any consideration to do Act 2, the third album, or even put it out on vinyl, anything like that?
We considered it. We might still do it. It's unfortunate due to COVID, obviously, with the timing of the second album, that played into our decision not to release a physical version. But there's been a lot of requests for it, and frankly, I'm a huge fan of the way the cover art turned out. So I'd love to put it on CD. And I think there's some developments going forward where we're working with some partners to get us a bigger European presence. And as part of that collaboration, we should be releasing physical copies of the next album, and potentially can also release some copies of Kindred Act 2.
Okay. All right, cool. Yeah, because like I said, I'm a collector. Like you can see some of my shit back there, and
I can see that. Yeah, that's
and
fucking awesome. Love it.
Yeah, and I'm always like I'll listen to it digitally, great, but I want to own it, have it in my hand.
Yeah.
So and I always
I respect that.
Yeah, I appreciate
that.
Yeah.
It's coming. I think we'll do it. It's hard not to. It was a difficult decision to make.
Yeah.
But people just weren't buying albums at the time, so it was like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a lot has strangely changed in like the last year or two as far as what comes out. Like cassettes are coming back, So, but as far as a Red Cain live show, what can people expect?
Some new stuff, hopefully, when we come back on stage. But We wanted to do a lot of bands are theatrical.
Mm.
That's fantastic. Nothing to take away from that. I think it serves very a lot of bands to make their sound as theatrical as possible and just have this like epic bombastic stuff. It is
Mm.
heavy metal, so we do want to do that, but we want to surprise people on live shows, and we do want to come back to the less kind of, I pick my words carefully here because I want to offend um, any people that like this kind of bombastic sound. I'd like it to be more raw.
Mm.
So when I was growing up, and I was seeing musicians, including my grandfather and others, playing on street corners, or performing in parks in front of large audiences, or even like halls, there's always this very very strong organic presence to it. And of course that can be said for any bands like Iron Maidens of the world and etc. They've kind of had that very organic stage presence that tends to be diluted nowadays because of the amount of technology and production and layering and lighting and etc. that gets on.
Mm.
It's a difficult thing to balance, to bring that rawness on stage. This is something that we're still very much learning about, but
Mm.
connecting with the audience through that and removing a bit of the divide between the artist and the audience
Mm.
is definitely something we love to do in our shows. Different ways to do that, but the focus is basically on having that very raw connection and not being as like a band behind a glass window.
Mm.
So, which is actually funny because during the pandemic, there were a couple of places that were literally having stages walled off with like plexiglass to avoid, COVID transmission, etc.
Oh,
So
wow.
it was a good idea at the time, but it was like it's a visual representation of what I'm trying to say.
Yeah,
So,
I understand.
but and then the other thing to it, of course, is we want to stay true to the material. So we're not half-assing anything. Anything on the album we can do live, but we also want to take it up a notch. So shit that you wouldn't hear on the album will make its way in the live shows to make them unforgettable.
Mm.
So always something that we've tried to do, and always something we will try to do down the road.
Excellent. Okay. Um, I would assume just kind of with being a live show playing band, there is one day hopes for a tour.
Yeah,
So
that's
where would
that's
you
always
go?
been. I mean, Europe would be
Mhm.
ideal. It's something we had considered, and we're kind of making inroads on before the pandemic hit. So
Mhm.
that repeated some of the plans, but we're again with the larger European presence that we're likely going to have in the near future. It's a possibility. For North America and close to home, absolutely, it's important to serve the domestic fan base. We'd love to go and meet all the people who listen to our music, whether it's like one town away or somewhere down in the United States. So if we can get that arranged, we absolutely will. It's just a matter of making sure that the scheduling, the bands who we would go with make sense,
Mhm.
and a lot of groundwork with venues and everything else. But,
Mhm.
but I think we're willing to do it. It's just our focus so far has been studio work. So the studio work has been great. The studio work I think we've nailed. So now there's definitely going to be some discussion about touring.
Okay. Um, my last question for you, is there a particular goal that you want to see achieved by the band? Is there like a point that you'll say like that's the brass rung I'm reaching for?
Uh, I want to play Bakken.
Okay. I think
So
everyone
that'd be
does,
nice.
but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I know exactly. I think realistically, if we if we can hit something like Prague Power, which is
Mhm.
a festival that I always admire and love the bands that perform there.
Mhm.
For us, I think that would be a very, very cool milestone. So
Okay. Okay.
definitely somewhere we're aiming at.
Awesome. All right. So, like I said, that's going to be my last of primary questions. What we like to do in interviews at the very end is do what we call the lightning round, and we just ask a couple of short questions, and you just answer as quickly as possible. They're mostly goofy
Let's fucking do
questions.
it.
All right. So let me pull it up. So first, boxers or briefs?
Boxers.
Chicken or steak?
Steak.
Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Waffle.
Tea. 50-50.
Waffles or pancakes?
Pancakes.
Okay. Cats or dogs?
Right now, dogs. I used to have
Okay.
a lot of cats, though. I love my dog.
Elvis Presley or the Beatles?
Elvis.
Okay. In Black Sabbath, do you prefer Dio or Ozzy singing?
Dio.
Okay.
With
In
all respect to Ozzy, though. Ozzy is awesome.
Very true. In Van Halen, do you prefer David Lee Roth or Sammy Hagar?
I think I'll go with David Lee Roth.
Okay. Who would win in an arm wrestling match, Lemmy or God?
I don't even think that God would want to challenge Lemmy in an arm wrestling match. So
well, that's a trick question. Lemmy is God, so
absolutely, yes. Or I mean, does God exist? Yes.
Yes. Sum up Metallica's last 25 years in 3 words or less.
Done, and done.
And finally, if your band, Red Cain, were stranded on a desert island, which member gets eaten first?
Ooh, I think it'll be me. I've got some probably some weight behind me because I do tend to work out and spend more time in the gym more than the other members. Plus, the singer always goes first. They're viewed as least essential. That's clearly not true, though. Like, come on.
It's been our experience that the bassist usually goes first.
Well, yeah, but come on. If you actually take it by who's going to provide the most sustenance for the longest amount of time and go very pragmatically about it, I think I'll get eaten first.
Yeah. Okay. I'll take it.
But I'll eat them first. I don't know. We'll find out. You'll have to challenge me for it before that happens.
Yeah, exactly. So again, Evgeniy, I want to thank you for meeting with me today and doing this interview. It was a great conversation.